Yeah, that's it. How about that? Is that okay? Is that okay? Okay.
Much better.
All right. All right, you can't sleep then, because you can hear me.
You don't have to be mean anymore.
I don't have to be mean anymore. Okay.
You're not mean.
Anyway, I'm a librarian. I fell into this trap by, hanging out at the San Francisco Art Institute, where they have this great photo program, and it turns out they always did have this great photo program. And then a few years later, I learned the history of it pretty early on, some of it, and then kept learning more and more and more of it, and then started to cross paths with a lot of these photographers who were in part of the first program. One of whom is David Johnson, who is the reason that we are here tonight. And what I'm going to do is just show you some images and some sort of, it's not the backstory and it's not the front story, it's just part of the story. And then David will fill you in on all the questions that you have afterwards, as well as sort of the backstory of how a lot more of this happened with, his life in some ways. I was also, although I'm a librarian, I was also trained as a historian, and I've always thought that history is really a compilation of biographies and change. And this story of David's is rich in both of these respects. The California School of Fine Arts, which is now the San Francisco Art Institute, as it appears here in a photograph, I think, by Ansel Adams in 1940. I learned this history of this program, this photography program at the Art Institute, from a guy named Purple Jones, who actually is also from Marin County, who lived in Marin County for most of his life. And Purple had been a student of Ansel Adams in the very first part of the after World War II, in the first classes there. And he taught there for about 30 years as well. And that's where I got to meet Purple, and he filled me in on the first-person details of the history of the early photo program at the Art Institute. During World War II, that school, this place, had very few students. And so they used the entire east wing of it as a blood bank for the soldiers in the Pacific Theater. They probably drew more blood there than any place in the country, more than one spot. So it sort of gives us, the students think that it has this haunted legacy to it, and that's probably part of it, this kind of vampire thing of all this blood that was drawn there. Here they are bringing down the only flag that ever flew over the school. There's no United States flag, I don't think it's ever flown over the school, but this Red Cross flag sure did fly over it for the years during World War II. Many of those soldiers who came to the school after World War II shipped back in through the Golden Gate, including people like David. They returned underneath the Golden Gate, visited San Francisco. I'm reminded to install Windows 10 here. There we go. The post-World War II students at the California School of Fine Arts had to wrestle with a lot of different facts. There have been 2 world wars in 30 years, the loss of life in the war, the Holocaust, and the atom bomb. They were ready to take up their lives again after years of being on hold, of those lives being on hold. And what helped them was that GI Bill that had been passed during World War II for all those returning soldiers and sailors. And it was really designed to educate a generation for this new economy that was going to develop after World War II, but it also gave opportunities to a lot of people who wanted to kind of wrestle with the philosophical issues of what the hell the world had come to at that point, to go to school at Berkeley and study poetry like Robert Duncan, or come to the Art Institute and study art and photography and painting and sculpture and try to figure out what that world was. And one of those people who arrived at the Art Institute at that time was, on the GI Bill, was David. Ansel's photograph of San Francisco at that time period of the Bay Bridge that was used in one of the school catalogs from that time period, that beautiful winter sky. The school had changed hands and had a renaissance after World War II, and they hired this guy, Douglas McCady, as the director. He brings in a lot of interesting people that he knew through his world of being in museums, including as speakers and as instructors, including in this picture, Marcel Duchamp in the lower left and Frank Lloyd Wright. Mark Rothko, an abstract expressionist painter, came there to teach painting during 2 different summer sessions. Here he is smoking up a storm in one of the studios. Rothko's mature paintings like this were developed while he was there at the school during the 2 summers that he was there. Here's an image of Rothko lecturing on contemporary art. He taught 2 classes each summer that he was there. He taught one, a lecture class, and when you look at the roll books, he gave everybody an A. And then he taught a painting class, and the painting class gave everybody a B. And I think that's kind of how he would have graded himself. You know, he would have been hard on himself with painting, especially at this time, as he's learning from, you know, these mature students who are there, who are kind of grappling with the same issues that he is, and he's developing his work, and they're learning from him at the same time. And so he figures out everybody gets a B in painting because we're all struggling, and everybody can interpretate what they like and what they see in the art world. He just happened to know more about it. Clifford Still, one of those abstract expressionist painters, also taught there. A photograph by a guy named Bill Hike, who was also a Marin resident later on, who was in the first photo program, you know, wrestling with the figure, you know, and they aren't looking at the figure. What are they doing? You know, somebody's doing surrealist painting, somebody's doing abstract painting. But they truly were wrestling with the figure. A lot of people decided they didn't want to paint those abstract expressionist paintings like Mark Rothko. And people like David Park started the Bay Area figurative painting things at the same time. They were in the late 1940s, at the same time that the photography department is developing. This image is actually a painting that was done of people, faculty at the school. It shows the painting by Park shows Douglas McCavey on drums there, and Emil Bischoff, another painter in Park who plays the piano in the Studio 13 jazz band that he is painting here. His ears there. Jazz was important to these people after World War II. You know, Ansel Adams was interested in classical music, but he thought jazz and other music informed artists, informed the visual artists as well. McCavey also introduced filmmaking as a fine art into the curriculum in the late 1940s. Here another Bill Hike again, a Marin County person, on one of the cameras, and Sidney Peterson smoking over his camera, who was the faculty member teaching at that time. And the photo department filled that vacuum that the Red Cross had left when they split from the east wing of the building. And it was started by Ansel Adams, shown here in the late 1940s. Ansel had anticipated that after the war, San Francisco and the Bay Area would develop into a magnificent photographic center that would lead the field in this country, if not the world. You know, that's the way Ansel thought, I think. You know, he always had these great big ideas about everything. And, you know, sure enough, he thought that about San Francisco, which kind of made sense in a lot of ways. And so he wanted to make sure he started this program there. You know, he brought in an incredible group of students, as evidence from this fall of 1946 roll book, which lists the names of the students at that time, one of whom is Ruth Marion Baruch, another Marin photographer, including David Johnson. If you scroll down there, this violates all sorts of those FERPA rules about privacy and education and stuff like that. You know, there they are, there's all their names. You know, I took off their grades, you know, and I'm not sure there even were grades given at that time, but if you look at David's name on there, yeah, David's right at the top. Look at that attendance. Damn, that was good. You know, a lot of them do pretty well, but David's solid. He's solid. An image of David from just before when he arrives at the Art Institute. Dave grew up in segregated poverty of Jim Crow, Florida. He was drafted into the military in World War II, where he experienced the last years of a totally segregated Navy. After the war, he returns to Florida and pursued the idea of becoming a photographer. He'd been taking pictures before and thought, I'm gonna do this. He reads about the program that Ansel's starting at the California School of Fine Arts, writes a letter to Ansel, and applies to the school, and he winds up at the train station. Ansel says, yeah, come on out. I'll have a Minor White, one of his other faculty members, meet you at the station. So he meets him at the train station. He gets picked up by Minor, and he gets whisked off to Ansel's house, which this is a contemporary picture of it on 24th Street, just above Baker Beach, which, as you all know, is right at the corner of Seacliff there. You know, where these kinds of images that Ansel would take. That's essentially Seacliff. You know, he was the youngest student in this class. These were very mature students who experienced a lot of the world and put their life on hold for a long time. And so the youngest student in the class and the only African American. You know, as David says in his autobiography, he felt like he was dropped through the rabbit hole and into the realm of photographic geniuses. And that's the truth. That was true. Here's David in a class with the optics expert in photography, a guy named Bob McAllister. It was an amazing assortment of students, including people like Ruth Mary Baruch, she'd already received the very first master's degree ever given to anybody in photography. Doing her MA thesis on Edward Weston. She was at Ohio University. She came out to do this this biography or this MA thesis on Weston. Weston introduces her to Ansel Adams, who says he's starting this photography program. And by then she realizes, maybe I don't know very much about photography when she sees these people. And so she decides to enroll in Ansel's classes at the Art Institute. She was one of the other students who also lived in Ansel's house at that time. She'd come out. So Ansel and David were both the people living in Ansel's house out near Seacliff. She had experienced racism as well, not to the degree of David's, but she had when she was denied housing in different places when attending the University of Missouri as an undergraduate because she was Jewish. But Ruth Marion was from a wealthy family, and she introduced David to his first French restaurant in San Francisco. And she obviously learned a lot from David as well as her photography changed over the next 20 years due to her experiences with people like David Johnson. Benjamin Chin was another one of those terrific students from that time period who also came to the school on the GI Bill. He'd grown up in Chinatown, so not too far away. You know, with his 11 brothers and sisters, had his own darkroom, and down on Commercial Street in Chinatown. His darkroom probably rivaled Ansel's. That's how good this guy was at technical stuff very early on, how good these people were. He was a photographer in the military during the war. But he printed at home. He didn't use their facilities at the school because he knew his were that good. He was one of the few photo students who also took painting classes with those painters like Clifford Still and Richard Diebenkorn and David Park, as well as taking those early avant-garde film classes with people like Sidney Peterson. One of Ben's photos, which appeared on the cover of the second issue of Aperture magazine, if any of you know that, is a photography magazine that started at the school during this time period. Another picture of one of Ben's photographs from a Paris street scene. Another photograph of David with Ben Chin from their time period when they were at the school. Here are more of some of those noted students in the first year of the program. And the darkroom with Ansel, Philip Hyde on the far left, who would go on to become the photographer for the Sierra Club in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s. John Bertolino, a very good friend of David's. Muriel Green, by Ansel there, who moved to France and wound up marrying a man who became France's Secretary of State in the 1970s. And Purple Jones on the right there, who married Ruth Mary Baruch and went on to collaborate on photo projects with Ansel, Dorothea Lange, and Ruth Mary Baruch, most notably their series that they did on the Black Panthers in 1968. John Bertolino, one of David's good friends in the photo department. Look at this painting he's in front of, too. That amazed me when I started to look at that photograph of him. I thought, what's he in front of there? And I realized I think that's this crazy painting that was done at that same time period that people were trying to figure out at the same time as figuring out the fine art photography. Right away, Ansel hires Minor White to assist with the teaching responsibilities, and Minor takes over much of the organizational aspects of the department, as well as he really was the intellectual force behind the photography department. Ansel, as much as he considered himself a fine artist and truly an artist, and not somebody who was a commercial artist or a documentarian or somebody who was a photographer that was going to do advertising art, although he did a lot of those things. Minor was the one who really could wrestle with fine art photography and put it in the same kind of vein as those abstract expressionist paintings. He was the one who brought in the psychological implications of photography and those other aspects of things that Ansel was not going to be part of that dialogue at all. Other of David's faculty included Dorothea Lange, a social documentary photographer noted for her fine Farm Security Administration photographs, like Migrant Mother here. Nancy and Beaumont Newhall, friends of Ansell's, and the first people who wrote photo history. He was the first curator of photography at the New York Museum of Modern Art. Imogen Cunningham, San Francisco photographer. Here's a nice image of Ansell and Imogen. And you realize Ansell, as big an ego as he had, it was so big that he was fine with bringing people in who thought differently than him. Imogen's looking at him here like, oh, Ansell, you pipsqueak. What do you know about it? You've just come to this. I've been photographing since 1905. I've been really thinking about this for a lot longer than you. But it made for a very rich, diverse faculty in a lot of ways. You see how Ansell thought that about the Bay Area with all these people who lived in this area. There were field trips that they took. Students went to Benicia to photograph, Mendocino, all the way to different places in San Francisco, as well as down to Monterey to visit Edward Weston on Point Lobos. Weston's leading a group of them hiking around. He would have them walk around without their cameras prior to photographing. He wanted them to see what they were doing and not see that world through the lens of their cameras. Nice picture of Edward Weston next to David there, and Minor White. And Muriel Green on the right, looking as lovely as ever. And when you look at David, those are the best dressed students for sure. The rest of them look like they're ready to go camping. They're ready to go with Ansell up to Yosemite and camp out. David, him and Muriel they paid attention. Then after, in the evenings, they'd go to Weston's place on Wildcat Hill, and he'd show the students his photographs. Beautiful images. Dorothea Lange in one of the studios explaining the differences between her social documentary approach to photography as opposed to Ansell's view of photography. And essentially explaining why Ansell's wrong with certain aspects of photography, which amuses the students to no end. You can see David there in front. They're all getting a big laugh out of everything. You see Bill Ike in the background, Bertolino sitting next to David. The dark rooms that they used at the school, which were good. I think they were good dark rooms. Although you kind of trained in Ansell's dark room, so you had the best. And you probably wouldn't. Did you ever go over to Ben Chin's dark room and use his ever? Yeah, he kept that one probably pretty secret. He probably had the best one. But they were all this was developed to Ansell's specifications. He made sure that they were good. They were a good facility. He wanted it to be good. The group lab as well. Image of the students working with their view cameras in an alley behind the school. Then the image of lighting class. And of course, Muriel Green is their model. In the second semester of their first year, Ansell receives his first Guggenheim. And he would wander off during that semester to photograph in the national parks. And this is, him up at Mono Lake, with his 8x10 tripod on top of his platform, on top of his Cadillac Woody there. And he'd come down from the mountains and participate in all the aspects of the school course, and he'd be lecturing and running through technical things. They thought of Ansell as being the technical person for all of the students, and they thought of Minor as being kind of that, the intellectual what were their pictures about, what was the content, and Ansell truly was the crafts person. And some of David's work during that time. David gravitated to documentary, street photography, of his time and his sense of place, especially in the neighborhood that he moved to after leaving Ansell's house in the San Francisco's Fillmore district. I mean, that's a hell of a photograph right there. When you are, there are crafts aspects to this thing as well as content and being of that moment in that photograph. And of course, at that time, you also had to have some guy with sunglasses on, to demonstrate that very early beatnik mentality of the 40s. And this is what has probably become one of David's most famous photographs, and it is of the Fillmore, which was taken in the late 1940s. capturing that same essence as sort of Henry Cartier-Bressont's thought of the decisive moment. You know, that's perfect. That's a split-second shot. One of my favorite sets of photographs of David's, which is of the Broad Street Baptist Church. I mean, look at those kids. God, that's true real life. You know, one great set, you know, marvelous photographs. A great triptych from 1946. You know, something Ansel probably wouldn't have understood, but Miner understood this conversation that was going on between these two women. More things than Fillmore. There's a reason, you know, why David's name is etched onto the streets of the Fillmore in that plaque of David Johnson, Fillmore photographer. Melrose Record Shop, late 1940s, 2012 on Fillmore. And the luminaries that visited San Francisco that David photographed. You know, there's portraiture involved with lots of these things too. You know, Nat King Cole, Langston Hughes, W.B. Du Bois. After completing the program, David set up Johnson's studio and did some sort of assignment work. Which this one I've always looked at, but never paid much attention to until recently. And then I realized how fascinating a fashion photograph this is by somebody who probably didn't think about much about fashion photography going up to this, although they're doing those lighting things in the studio. But this one really is kind of spectacular. And there's a woman from the second from the right, Vanetta McGee, who winds up becoming a Hollywood actress who's in lots of films from the 60s and 70s and television shows and different things. And she's a San Franciscan. But David explained to me this photograph. I should let him explain this one, but he'll tell you about this when we can go back to it at some point. But it's just a wonderful fashion photograph that comes from somebody who might be a novice doing fashion photography at the time, but who obviously was very well trained and saw a lot and learned from a lot of different people and had that perfect sense. Civil rights movements photographs that David did in the late 50s through the 1960s. One's from the March on Washington in DC, which are now owned by the Library of Congress. And San Francisco politics. Willie Brown campaigning for the California Assembly. And David here, I think, is really mixing his fashion photography sensibilities and his traveling in those political circles as well. I mean, that's, you know, Willie Brown was always a fashion person too, so you figure, okay, yeah, that's it. Ansel stayed attached to the program after he got yet another Guggenheim and did more things. But he would come back and do special lectures and view camera classes throughout the 50s and actually all the way through the 1970s. You know, note in this image, you know, Ansel's Cadillac is, you know, he's upgraded his Cadillac in the back. It's no longer woody, and he's got the zone system on it. If you know the zone system of photography, with a, you know, from one range of black to the whitest white, and you have his, you know, he still has his platform on top for shooting in the national parks, but he upgraded his Cadillac. He was always a Cadillac person, I think. Miner went on to be the first editor of Aperture magazine. He leaves the Art Institute in 1952 and goes to Rochester, New York, and then he winds up at MIT. Many of the first photographs published in Aperture magazine, those first few years, first 10 years actually, were done by students and faculty from the school. Miner, he does go to Rochester, and he comes back to lecture at different times in the 50s and into the 60s to give advice about the future of the photography program. Here he is back on one of those visits, and he and Ansel are reconnected. And then a reunion with Miner and his students. Here he is with David on his right and Charles Wong on his left, and Benjamin Chin in the classes there, and Stan Zernich, another Marin photographer in front left there. These were White's true photo comrades. These were the people that Minor White, Ansel, and all those people felt very comfortable with. You know, and Minor White wrote about teaching in this program that David was in a few years later that was published in Aperture. He titled it A Unique Experience in Teaching Photography, you know, as being a fabulous experiment because of the nature of San Francisco, quote, cosmopolitan, dramatic, Western, full of verve, coupled with the luminaries of photography who were attached to the department, but most importantly to the quality of the students. Minor thought it essentially a program in photography at the graduate level. And David was one of these splendid students learning from the best in a hothouse of contemporary art. And this is where he learned, along with these other amazing students, and as Minor said, how to see with the eyes of a poet. Flyer for a retrospective that was held in San Francisco a couple of years ago at the Harvey Milk Photo Center. That beautiful picture, Fillmore. Now, as a librarian, a little bibliography. In Ansel's book, autobiography, he deals with Albert Bender in a chapter, who was his person who introduced him into the photo world, to the art world that he brought the fine art photography into, and he also devotes a chunk of it to his teaching at the California School of Fine Arts. There's a book on The Moment of Seeing, titled The Moment of Seeing, Minor White at the California School of Fine Arts, which is about the first years of that program. And the most recent book called The Golden Decade, which is about all those students from that time period, from 1945 to 1955. And now you get to hear the rest of the story, the real story, the back story, and the front story from David himself. So, Dave, come on.
Thank you very much. I'm exceedingly pleased with the turn this evening. I told my fellow residents at the Tamalpais that Mr. Gunderson would be here. Great fan of the library. And they responded. I'd like to take you back a little bit to how I got involved in this business, I call it that. After returning from the Philippines and get my discharge from the Navy,
Can't hear you.
I was employed. Can you hear me now, Jackie?
Can you hear? No, I can barely hear you.
You can barely hear me?
You think you just keep it real close to your mouth. Yeah.
How about that? Is that better? Do I have to repeat everything I said? Thank you.
There we go.
Thank you. What I intended to emphasize, aside from the photography, was, would you help me with part of my childhood? What happened all those years before I attended the California School of Fine Arts? The lady there, her name is Alice Johnson. That's where I took my last name from. I doubt very much if she was married to someone named Johnson. My mother worked as a maid in the hotels of Jacksonville, Florida. Mind you that Flagler is well ahead in transporting people from the north down to Florida for the winter. And they were the snowbirds, okay, which provided employment for many of the people who lived in Jacksonville, including the photograph of Alice. It's kind of unique about how I got involved with Alice, because my mother says, I don't know quite what to do with this kid. And Alice says, I'll take him. And she did. And I spent most of my life, all of my life with Alice. It's debatable whether Alice was married to someone named Johnson. It was also debatable whether, who is this father of this kid? So not too long ago, several years ago, a couple years ago, Jack and I did some research on where did you come from, David? Where did you come from? Well, the Gullahs in the south part of Atlantic. Many, many black people were brought to that part of the world to grow rice. And I got added to this library supplied me with ample amount of information I needed before Jack and I proceeded on the trip. Now, how do we get the money for the trip? the San Francisco Art Commission had some of my work in their files. And I said, Jackie, I think we got the answer for our trip to go to where the Gullers are. They bought 6 or 7 of my photographs. So we had sufficient money to take our flight, rent cars and all that, and spend an amount of time. And fortunately for me, I'm married to a lady who is an excellent driver and planner and so forth. I have to put this in, you understand, right? No, Jackie is really a very good partner in our relationship. And I want to shift back to the lady who took care of me when I was a kid. My mother, well educated for that part of time. She probably did the 7th grade or so. Alice never went to school. She was illiterate. But what she cared about was being the caretaker for me while my mother did her work. And I was very comfortable with Alice, and she didn't spare the rod. She said, you're going to do what I want you to do, and you won't ask any questions. And in terms of being a motivator, she said to me one day, David, if you learn to sweep good, you know, you'll get jobs. That was her orientation of what the world was like. Because that's what black people did mostly in those days. We were janitors and sweepers and so forth. And I lived with her for a long time, and I would write letters for her, because part of her people still lived in Fitzgerald, Georgia. That's where the people migrated to the South to work on the farms and all. And I would write letters for Alice, and Alice wanted me to end it I will close this letter, but not my heart. I thought that was rather poetic from a lady who had never been to school in her life. And it enriched my life to live with this lady who had little or no education, but was willing to look after me while my mother worked in the hotel. So I want to stay with the story about Alice. Alice met some gentleman who said, we're in Jacksonville, Florida now. There's some jobs available on some land down in South Florida and need workers, you know, migrant workers sort of. So we went to a little town called Pahokee, Florida, okay? And Alice had kind of a hot temper. You didn't kind of mess with her, even as growing up in her house. So apparently, on the weekend, the workers would get together and have fun, you know, play cards, maybe shoot dice and do music. And Alice apparently did not get along with one of the other workers. And they had a little clash. And John Henry, her boyfriend, who took us down there, came over to rescue Alice. Alice was in trouble because this other lady was getting the best of her. And during that encounter, a knife appeared and someone got hurt. The lady got hurt severely. The sheriff came and arrested Alice and arrested John Henry. So I'm without them, and the social worker said, don't worry, we'll get you, David, back to Jacksonville. So my mother was there in Jacksonville, so the social workers brought me back to Jacksonville. And I was an unhappy camper, because all my life I had lived with Alice, and she was my mother, you know, and this Willie Mae was my mother, but she gave me birth, but I was not accustomed to it. I was very unhappy. So Alice remained in the Florida State Prison for Women for several years. And meanwhile, I lived with Willie Mae, my mother. So when Alice was released from prison, she came to Jacksonville and said, I want my son back. And Willie Mae was not going to argue with Alice. she knew better. And I was very happy. I was so pleased to see Alice again and to be with her. She said, Willie Mae said, well, you can take him whenever you want to. So she took me back and to her house. And I remember things like, I'm growing now and my shoes are not, you know, the same size as they were. Alice went to work, and worked long enough to buy me a pair of shoes. The shoes could have been, what, about $5 or $3. She was committed solely to my success in life. So once I moved away, I'm going to fast forward this a bit, and I left Alice, and I was living in her house when I came to California to study photography. I had to find a way to have Alice come to California to see my wife at that time, our first child. So she got to see what really was her grandchild. She stayed with us for a while, and then she went back to Jacksonville. And I made sure that Alice had an insurance policy. And when she died, I kept insurance for her so she could get a proper burial. And the insurance was that. But that was my life. This lady was dedicated to me totally. And the photograph here was taken, one of my early photographs before I knew anything about Ansel Adams and the zone system. So my own little camera that I carried around, I photographed Alice. And I can remember on another occasion, Alice and I did some traveling in Florida, and we stopped at a Greyhound station, which was now desegregated. So I kept telling her, it's okay, Alice, if we go in and sit down and have a cup of coffee. She said, I want to go in there. I said, come on, it's okay now. It's not like it used to be, Alice, but she was accustomed to, it's probably not the right word, of a segregated society where black people were called, she couldn't read or write, and we went to do any business, and they said to Alice, put your nigger sign there. You know what that was? X. How insulting can it be? So that was the kind of life I lived with Alice, but she was totally committed to my success in life in her own manner. And she is really, I have to give Alice a lot of credit for raising me and keeping me in line. And a little example now, we didn't have much money, so we rented a house. And it was a cart I slept on, a cart, steel cart. And I woke up one night and there's Alice getting the bed bugs, the bed bugs out of me. Make sure that they didn't crawl into my ear or something like that. She was that committed to me and my success. And once I came to California, I made sure that I had an insurance policy for her. And on one occasion, Alice came to visit me and my wife at that time before Jack and I married. So my oldest son was a baby at that time, so Alice got to see really a grandchild. And I was so pleased that we could do that for her. And once she died, I went back to Florida and made sure she was married. So it was kind of that, what I'm talking about. That was the background that I came up in. And I learned how to play the harmonica, which I play now sometimes. I'm not prepared to play it tonight. And I was the only kid in the area who could play the harmonica. When people knew I was around coming down the street because I was playing the Mills Brothers, Paper Doll or something. So it was not a house where there was books. It was not a house where we were taken to the museum and that sort of thing. This is segregated Florida at that time. But despite of that, I read magazines, which leads me to Ansel Adams. So before that, I sold a subscription to some people in my neighborhood. And whoever subscribed to this magazine got a prize, and so did I. And what do you think my prize was?
Camera.
A camera. Right, it was my first camera. So I got interested in this camera, and I started snapping pictures of my relatives and friends and all. And I valued that very much. And something said, you know, David, maybe there's something in this for you. Really? Yeah. Think about it. This voice is talking to me. So now I'm out of the Navy now, been back a little bit. And I've gone to work in the Naval Air Station where I worked prior to my being drafted. Because they start drafting people at 17 about that time. Because the troops are coming home from Europe and they needed replacements. So I was drafted. And I said to my boss, look, I'm drafted, so I will be leaving. He said, okay, you know, we know how it works. When you return from the service, he's very positive about that. Come back and you'll have your job. So I went to the service. And part of being in the service was I was trained by the Navy at a base where they call it Tan Ferran. It may have been a racetrack at that time. The Navy took that over to train sailors to go overseas. So I was training there, and one weekend, I didn't take the Greyhound bus and come into the city. For some reason, I didn't have a buddy that I traveled with. So I got off of the Greyhound bus on 7th Street, big building there now. The Greyhound bus station was there years ago. It's right near the same block that the post office is located in. So I'm traveling to San Francisco by myself, and I walked over to this white dude. I don't use that term if you don't mind. And I said, where do black people live? He said to me, you get on the bus, you get off at Fillmore and Geary. Fillmore and Geary. The cover of my book, you notice that Fillmore? That's where I first encountered the Fillmore district. And little did I know the impact that visiting to San Francisco would have on me. I couldn't think about, you could come back here one day and photograph. That didn't even occur to me. But that was my first contact. So I got on the bus and I arrived at Fillmore and Geary. I looked at all these black people down the street, servicemen everywhere and all that. So each time I came into San Francisco and that point on, I would stop on Fillmore Street. So I was raised in the church, right? So I met a young lady on the street on one of my visits, and I says, you know, as sailors do, I come to town here every now and then. She said, yeah, I'd like to see you again, but I'm a church lady. You know, I have a problem with the church. The church was going to ultimately lead to something else. So I would come into San Francisco on my weekend, and I would go to this church. Little did I know that once I returned in that very same church, a little boy would be sitting on the steps, and it would become my iconic photograph of Clarence. You've seen Clarence. You must have seen Clarence. And there may be a photograph of Clarence here. And little did I know that that would be my iconic photograph. And coming back to the California School of Fine Arts, one of my colleagues said, David, that's a nice picture. Why don't you send it to the Chronicle? Yeah, okay. And the assignment was do an environmental photograph. I wasn't sure what an environmental photograph was. But for me, photographing Clarence meant a great deal. And I sent it to the Chronicle on advice of one of my classmates. The first dollar I made was chosen the photograph of the month. And I think the Chronicle sent me $25. Not bad. I'm already making money. So it ultimately became my iconic photograph. And I'm indebted to people like Alice who took care of me. And she had very little to offer me in terms of material things. And I would write letters for her. And here's something kind of interesting. She would end her letters, I will close my letter, but not my heart. I thought that was real poetic for a woman who had no education as such, you know. And she really is someone that I just value having lived with her. And once, I just want to go back to the problem that Alice had when she went down to work on the farm. And she and one of the other farmer ladies got into some difficulty. And a knife was passed around somewhere, and Alice was blamed to a knifing this lady. So the sheriff came, arrested Alice and Alice's boyfriend, John Henry. So, what are you going to do with David? What's your name, son? David Johnson. My mother lives in Jacksonville, Florida. So the social worker got in touch with Willie Mae and took me back to Jacksonville. Years later, Alice was released from prison, and she came to Jacksonville and said, I want my boy back. And Willie Mae was not going to tangle with Alice. She said, well, here he is. I was so happy to see Alice, because I identified her as, that's just my mother. This is my mother. She takes care of me. And it was Alice's house I lived in when I wrote the letters to Ansel Adams asking to be admitted to the school. And I'm getting a little signal here, so I guess I need to wind it up. Thank you, dear. I'm winding it up, all right? I can do that openly, see. So, arriving in San Francisco and taking the course in Angeles and all the subsequent photographs that I was able to take, I couldn't have dreamed of that, taking that course and living in this neighborhood. Just think of it, I've been living in a totally white neighborhood when some of the scenes were not available to me. So that's kind of how it all went down. And coming to the California School of Fine Arts and meeting this gentleman here was really a plus for me. You've been really wonderful and supportive of me, and I appreciate that very much. Absolutely.
It's great to be around great photographers.
Yeah. And I'm pleased to share my life with you and my photographs of the March on Washington, which I presented putting these together. And they were scanned and, not in the dark room. I don't know what happened to the dark room. It's not what happened to the dark room. The dark room is still there, right? Well, I'm so pleased to be here and share my life with you and the photographs. And thank you very much. You might have any questions?
Yeah.
How long did you attend the school in San Francisco before you?
I think the course was 2 years.
You were there 3 years.
3 years. Yeah.
And they went, instead of 15 or 16 weeks like they do now, they went 18 weeks, and they would go from 8 o'clock in the morning until probably 6 at night, and then they would meet again and continue to discuss work. So it was a long 3 years that you were immersed in photography.
That's right. That was everything. That was everything to me. That photograph of me that is, the war is over, and many of the uniforms, that sort of thing, the sailors wore in the shops and all. So I didn't have much money. I bought this jacket, and it was just right for me. And I'm grateful that I was able to make that change in my life. It meant so much. You make those steps in your life, you don't know where they're going to lead to. But what I have adopted now is I expect the positive results of whatever I'm involved in. Positive results. And I tell my grandchildren this, and I tell young people when I speak to them, expect the positive results. And Jackie and I have a little game we play, parking. Well, Jackie, you need a parking angel. You can relate to this, right? So we're driving all around. I said, well, talk to your parking angel, and in no time there's a parking space. In no time there's a parking space. And
talk a little about your march to Washington.
my what?
March to Washington.